Oh, Pikachu, you're gonna be hanging out in the living room until you decide to go to bed? Okay, I'll be out there in like an hour. Okay, hello, beautiful bookworms. And today I'm going to get you chapter 2 of Curious Tides. Now, if you recall, in the last chapter, it had Emery returning to Aldrin and beginning to look for answers as to why 8 of her fellow classmates at Aldrin College ended up dying in a strange way. Now, I've already read this book all the way through, so without further ado, here we go. Chapter 2 starts on page 23, and this is Baz's point of view. So, without further ado, here we go. It was not unusual for Baz to lose track of time, which truly had to be the height of all irony, given the nature of his magic. A book was all it ever took to hold him captive, make him forget, to eat, to sleep, to exist in his own body. Naturally, nothing contented him more than libraries, and Aldrin College had plenty of those to indulge his fondness. 4 to be exact, a library for each of the main lunar houses and a 5th, if you counted the small collection amassed down in an obscure hall, home of the Eclipse students. The Baz firmly believed that a few shelves of dusty tomes in a severely underused classroom did not a library make. Even if it did offer the quietest backdrop for studying, even quieter now, he supposed, was Kai gone. Now, Kai, we will find out more about him. He is a fellow Eclipse born. And then there was the vault, the heart of all knowledge, hidden in Aldrin's lower levels at the juncture between its 4 libraries. It housed some of the world's most precious and ancient texts, carefully warded against thieves and unwanted eyes, and the cruel passage of time. Only a select few professors and students were ever granted access, and only if the dean of students herself allowed it. 3 long years at Aldrin, and Baz had not once stepped foot in the vault, despite all the research he helped Professor Solandin with, which often required the perusal of such texts. Oh, goodness. The perusal of such texts as those found in the vault. But the A.J. Eclipse professor, who was an omnilinguist, player on a reveler magic that allowed her to understand and speak any language she encountered, a rather benign ability as far as eclipse magic went, yet one which brought her wide respect, which was peculiar when it came to her books and her research. She trusted Baz implicitly as her teaching assistant, yet she never let him do much more than run errands and transcribe her handwriting notes on his typewriter, near impossible task given the illegibility of her penmanship, but one he'd come to master all the same. Today was different. Professor Solandin needed a book for her new research topic, the mythology surrounding the disappearance of the tides, and had sent him to retrieve it from the vault in her place. It's your last year of undergrad, she told him this morning when he'd gone to see her instead of heading to the assembly hall. It's time I start giving you more responsibilities if you're serious about becoming a professor. He heard the unspoken words in the ensuing silence, seen the truth of them in the grief she wore like a shawl, that with Kai gone, and Baz the only one left under her tutelage, her heart wasn't in it, the teaching. That he would likely be leading her studies, himself this year, while she remained in her office with her books and research and endless supply of tea. The vault's permission desk was manned by a vaguely familiar student, her waxing moon tattoo, a muted silver crescent entwined with a creeping vine of blooming indigo hollyhocks, was stark against the tawny brown of her hand, which held up an all too familiar book, Song of the Drowned Gods, one of the newer editions from the looks of it. A thrill of excitement ran through Baz. He wasn't one for small talk or social interaction, really. Something Romy had constantly reminded him, always trying to get him to engage in anything other than his books. But if he must speak to people, he didn't. Oh, goodness. Something Romy had constantly reminded him of, always trying to get him to engage in anything other than his books. But if he must speak to people, he didn't mind it being about this. Has the scholar found the other worlds yet? The girl's mouth quirked up as she set her book down. Just a sea of ash, but I'm almost at the part where he finds the witchwood. The ribcage that wraps around the heart of the world, Baz recited. The girl dramatically pressed a hand over her heart. My favorite, she gave him a rueful smile. Baz palmed the back of his neck, incapable of thinking up more words. Behind the desk was an impressive silver door set into the crude stone wall, wrought with intricate motifs of frothy waves and the tides of fate themselves, fitting guardians for what lay beyond. You have your permission slip? The girl asked. He set his pile of books down on the counter and pulled the prized piece of paper from his bag, excitement tingling at his fingertips. The clerk's gaze caught on his outstretched hand, and any warmth that had been in her eyes vanished as she made sense of the sigil inked on his skin. Baz had always thought that The eclipse signia was the most striking of the house sigils, a dark moon eclipsing a golden sunflower, the petals of which were rendered in the finest of details. Yet it was deceiving, that delicate beauty. For nothing about House Eclipse was delicate, not particularly beautiful, especially not in the eyes of other students. The girl's smile faltered. Recognition dawned as it tended to do. Baz fought to keep his own smile from slipping. Dean Fulton signed off on it this morning, he said, still holding the slip aloft between them. Every second the girl didn't grab for it left a dent in the armor around his heart. He was used to it by now, the unease that spread like wildfire whenever people realized what he was. Who he was. What he was. It never stung any less, though, and after his encounter with Emery in the quad, the way she brushed him off as if scared to be in his presence for longer than was necessary, the sting went deeper than ever. He still remembered a time when Emery had been enthralled by all things Eclipse, when she hadn't looked at him the way everyone else did, as if he were a ticking time bomb ready to go off. Back then she'd made him feel like there was more to him than his magic. Tides, she'd gone so far as to make him like his magic. A sentiment that felt as foreign to him now as the budding friendship they'd once had, long since withered to dust. At last the clerk reached for his slip. She read it over carefully, scribbling things in the ledger in front of her. Silence roared around them. Were he any less careful, Baz might have turned back time, wound the minutes back to before he showed his hand, and the shadow cursed sigil that always made people treat him differently. But time ticked painfully on until finally the girl rummaged through a drawer and handed him a delicate silver cuff. Special protocol for Eclipse students, she explained, sounding almost apologetic. In case you. She made a vague motion with her hand. You know. Her meaning was clear, in case his magic slipped, becoming so uncontrollable that it brought about his collapsing. A gruesome, imploding of a self that awaited Eclipse-born who couldn't keep their magic in check. Right. Baz grabbed the magic dampener, trying to fight the flush creeping up his neck. The damper was more symbolic than anything else, a mere show of good faith, given he could easily take it off himself. He didn't mind wearing it. He was a stickler for rules, after all, but on the rare occasions he was required to do so, all he could think of was how dampers were made of Eclipse magic, silver imbued with the power of nullifiers, which was one of the more common gifts among Eclipse-born. Add to this the fact that the same magic was used on those who collapsed, branded onto their skin to permanently seal off their magic, and the irony alone was enough to make him sick. Sorry, the girl mumbled. Necessary precaution. Baz wished he could disappear forever. A part of him understood, though. Eclipse magic was erratic, unpredictable. Nothing like the structured, limited thing the other lunar houses practiced. And if he were to suffer his collapsing while in the presence of such invaluable books, a necessary precaution indeed. Baz dutifully snapped the damper around his wrist as the clerk mumbled another apology. It's fine, he assured her. Fine, Emery had said in the quad, even though she had appeared anything but. It had been written all over her pallid face, how haunted and hollow she was. Baz couldn't reconcile the girl with the one who had lived in his memory. Blue eyes crinkled in laughter, hair whipping behind her like strands of gold as she ran ahead of him in the fields of the youth, trying to catch up to his sister. It was as if the most vibrant piece of her had drowned last spring, lain to rest with Romy in the depths of Dovermere. The way she brushed off her absence at Romy's funeral as if she'd missed something as trivial as a study session or a coffee date. Baz tried not to let it irk him. He could only imagine the sort of trauma she must be dealing with. If he'd been in her shoes, he likely wouldn't have had much strength for the funeral either. He'd already been holding on by a thread as it was, trying to organize everything on his own while his mother wallowed in her grief. Baz, it would have been nice, but it would have been nice to have Emily there, to not have to bear the burden of grief alone. And Clark cleared her throat, tapping the pen against the ledger. The rules are as follows. You're granted 30 minutes inside the vault. In this allotted time, you're welcome to peruse the vault's collection, but you may not take any other title than the one you've been approved for. She glanced at the permission slip and corked a brow at the title inked on top. The Tides of Fate and Shadow of Ruin, Theological Study in the History of Lunar Magics by Holken et al. Sorry, guys. I have to do some readjusting. Buzz mumbled something about it being for research, suddenly aware of how dull it must sound. The mythology surrounding the tides and the shadow was prevalent in their modern world, but it had long since stopped being something people truly believed in, as it once had been. Nowadays it was a fable they were told as children, an origin story for their magic, and the source of much of their deep-rooted contempt that House Eclipse was held in. You'll find your book in aisle H. There's another clerk inside if you need help finding your way. Lastly, magic is strictly prohibited while you're in the vault. The girl gave him a sidelong glance. Though I guess that won't be a problem. The cuff seemed to burn against his skin. Any questions? Baz eyed the copy of the Song of the Drowned Gods she'd set on the counter. Though it might be Professor Salandon's research that got him into the vault. The only title Baz longed to find was his favorite book's original manuscript, to touch the very pages that Cornus Clover himself had written upon. For fans like Baz, it was already privilege enough to walk the halls of Aldrin knowing Clover had been a student here long ago, to sit in the same classrooms and haunt in the same libraries late at night. Very few ever got the chance to set eyes on his actual manuscript. Baz had hoped to be one of them, but the clerk's unease pressed against him, and all he could do was shake his head no. He'd find his own way to the manuscript if time permitted. The girl proceeded to unlock the silver door behind her with an looking key. The door pushed outward before sliding left, hissing across the stone floor as muted light spilled from within. She turned to Baz, blocking the way inside. "You're Romy's brother, aren't you? The time spinner." Baz blinked at the familiar way she'd said his sister's name, trying not to flinch at the sound of that Tide's damned title. Time spinner. Spoken with a terrible sort of awe. She nodded. He nodded past the lump in his throat. "She was quite the dreamer," the girl said, and though her eyes were shaded so that Baz couldn't see the foulness in them, He heard it well enough in the soft lilt of her voice. It didn't surprise him, really. Romy had been a bright light who effortlessly pulled people in. He always admired her carefree attitude, the ease with which she moved and talked and dreamed. A part of him might have even envied her for it. Tides, he missed her. The clerk stepped aside and Baz promptly went through the door, the magic of old books beckoning him forward. "I'll see, by the way," the girl called after him. She looked at him over her copy of Song of the Drowned Gods as she settled back in her seat. "That's where you'll find the manuscript." The silver door shut, seemingly of its own accord, and Baz stood alone in the vault. He wound his way down a narrow stone corridor lined with elaborate bronze sconces, all lit with magic everlight, a centuries-old invention that lightkeepers of House Full Moon had perfected that stood the test of time even against the rise of electricity. The corridor seemed to go on forever until it spilled into a large circular room around which were additional passages, these ones lined with books. It gave Baz the impression of staring at the center of a clock face, the aisles like the clock's minute marks, up and up the rows of shelves climbed, all the way to the vaulted ceilings above, where a curtain of water fell from an opening in its middle. Baz approached the marble rail in the center of the room, and could almost touch the delicate waterfall on the other side, felt its cold mist on his face. He knew the water came from the fountain of faith up in the quad, which meant he must be directly overhead, and spilled into the darkness below his feet, too far down for him to discern the bottom, if there was one at all. For once Baz was all too aware of time slipping by, and so he promptly made his way to the H aisle, and where the tides of fate and shadow and ruin was easy enough to find. It was quite possibly one of the largest books he'd ever seen. His arms buckled under the weight of it as he heaved it off its shelf. He knew about it by now, then, to question Professor Salandon's research, no matter how tired or innocent or ludicrous her topics might seem at first. He once helped her compile a list of lesser-known swamps around the world, and was awed at the brilliant paper she then produced on the varying effects of salt water and fresh water used in bloodletting practices. And last year, when she had researched the influence of blood moons over the mating tendencies of bloody belly-combed jellyfish, Baz thought she might have finally gone mad. The award she received for that paper proved him wrong. I only have a couple pages left, ladies and gentlemen, so thank you for being patient with me. Beatrix Salandon's mind was praised in every academic circle there was. At Aldrin, at least, she didn't experience the kind of antagonism other Eclipse-born did, and how lucky he was to be her assistant. Still, he couldn't help but why she decided to research a myth that pinned their very own house as once before the tides vanished. As the myth went, magic was said to have been accessible to all, no matter the moon phase one was born to. People could divine the future and make the plants grow and produce light and darkness and walk no and walk could produce light and darkness and walk into dreams and reap lives all at once, so long as they made offerings to the tides. But when the deities left their shores, they splintered magic into lunar houses and tidal alignments, making it so that those with magic could only practice a single ability they were born with. And because the tides were thought to have forsaken their world, in order to defeat the Shadow of Ruin, the dark, unhallowed figure associated with House Eclipse. Naturally, the Eclipse Born had shouldered the blame for centuries. People believed Eclipse magic was stolen from the Tides, something that should never have belonged to them. They were the outliers in magic, wielders, a rarity entirely belonging to the sacred, not entirely belonging to the sacred lunar cycle the world revolved around, and as such, everything about them was made to be contrary. Where others had their sigils tattooed on their right hand, the Eclipse Born had theirs on their left. While each of the four main lunar houses was associated with one of the tides, theirs was linked to the shadow, the bringer of bad omens, the great eye in the sky that shadowed the world and gave those like bats their odd, twisted powers. And while the other houses, this is magic, followed a careful cycle, a fully formed thing only during one's ruling phase, thus only accessible for a few days every month, unless called upon through bloodletting. Eclipse magic. Sorry, guys. Eclipse magic could be accessed at all times, no matter the moon's position, no bloodletting needed. That kind of relentless power, some people were envious of it, but it was a burden, a curse. It was why Baz had kept books and knowledge, choosing to hone his mind rather than testing the limits of his time-bending ability. He knew many would kill to have such a gift, even if it belonged to House Eclipse, seeing it as power unmatched, a force to rival gods, a way to unmake the very fabric of life as they knew it. Baz himself had thoughts of using it to undo the things that haunted him most. His sister's death, his father's collapsing. He would never dare risk it. Time was of a slippery nature, and eclipse magic was not to be trifled with. It was because of this that Baz wished to become a professor here at Aldrin, why he'd wanted to be Professor Salandon's assistant. He'd seen one too many Eclipse born, consumed by their power, and maybe this way he could help them. He could help prevent more of them from collapsing. Baz hugged the heavy book back, lugged the heavy book back to the center of the vault, where he glanced around for the aisle, other aisle clerk had mentioned. It was only a couple of rows down, and no sign of her colleague, nor anyone else for that matter. He couldn't resist. He headed down the sea aisle. The Song of the Drowned Gods manuscript was displayed on a delicate easel inside a locked glass box. It was nothing but flimsily bound, yellowing pages, but the sight of the fascinating title on its battered cover made Baz's soul stir. How he longed to feel it in his hands, to read the words as Cornus had initially thought them. He looked over the shoulder, then the other. Would it be so wrong for him to break the rules just this once? He might never get a chance to step inside the vault. Without thinking, Baz set the Tides of Fate and Shadow of Ruin next to the glass case, and unclasped the silver cuff around his wrist. Power thrummed an answer deep in his veins. Before he could change his mind, he called his magic forward ever so carefully. It was a small enough thing to reach for the threads of time linked to the particular lock, to seize the one that led to a time when it was unlocked. With a click, the mechanism on the case gave way. The glass panel opened at his touch, and there was Song of the Drowned Gods, hid for the taking. Baz felt like a scholar in the story, reaching for a strange book that might carry him to other worlds. He put on a pair of white cotton gloves meant for handling old texts, and took it reverently between his hands, flipping to the first page. There is a world at the center of all things, where drowned gods reign over a sea of ash, he read aloud. He held his breath in one waited to feel himself beneath the careless skies he read so often about. A foolish child's part of him daring to hope it might actually work. But there was no such thing as portals, no matter how transportive a piece of writing might be. Baz laughed at himself. Curious, he flipped to the back of the book, where there was evidence of a single ripped-out page, all that was left of it now, a torn fringe scarring the spine. He had heard the rumors, of course, on the apparent epilogue discarded before the story ever made it to print. Kai had talked about it all the time, obsessed with theories on what Clover might actually have written. Maybe it ends with it all having been one. There's a cuss word. Freaked. Dream. He joked, and maybe the scholar inhaled too much moldy old book fumes and went on some wild psychedelic trip. Buzz had rolled his eyes at him. Like Clover would have stooped so low. Guess we'll never know, will we? Baz gently flipped through the rest of the pages, conscious of the time slipping past. He thought of using his magic again to make the minutes stretch just a bit longer, but one bent rule was already too much. He was about to put the manuscript back in its case, back in its glass box, when a piece of paper fell from it, landing at his feet. For a delirious moment, Baz believed it might be the lost epilogue, but it was only a note scribbled in haste, ink bleeding on a torn bit of paper, and the penmanship. He knew the curving letters, the needlessly elaborate question mark. The call heard between the stars equals Dovemir? Find epilogue. The floor pitched beneath his feet. He read the note again and his throat constricting with the impossibility of what he was holding. Something that even more delicate and precious than the manuscript itself. It was Romy's handwriting. No doubt about it. She had underlined Dovemir multiple times with such vigor, Baz was shocked her pen hadn't pierced the paper. The note cut off abruptly, the final E in the epilogue trailing into a messy scribble that told Baz she'd been in a hurry. He couldn't make sense of it. His sister had never cared for the Song of the Drowned Gods, or at least had long since grown out of it, always teasing him about his obsession with what was essentially a children's book. So why the sudden interest in Clover's manuscript and its lost epilogue? How had she even gotten permission to come down here? He ran a finger along the scribble, wondering if she might have been here without permission. If she'd been startled or caught while writing the note, leading her to leave it in the manuscript's pages. His insides thrummed as he recalled the conversation he'd had with her a few months before the drowning, before everything between them had soured. They'd gone home for the winter solstice, and Romy had been whistling a maddening tune under her breath the week they were there. When Baz finally snapped and asked her what in the deep that God's awful singing was, her eyes had sparkled with that dreamy look she'd often get. It is a song I hear in my dreams sometimes. She'd grabbed his dog-eared copy of Song of the Drowned Gods from his hands, laughing at his indignation. Just like in your precious story, Baz had snorted at that. So you're hearing the divine now. Or maybe, she whispered in a mock spiritual tone, it's the guardian luring me to his gate. That's not... The guardian didn't lure anyone. He literally knew the drowned gods were tricksters and still thought it was a good idea to draw everyone a map to their doorstep, or whatever I'd call that. Luring. She wasn't entirely wrong. In the story, the young guardian in the fourth realm was the one to guide the story's heroes to the very gates of the Sea of Ash, where they would eventually free the drowned gods, only to be trapped there in their place. If the gods were the composers of the Stevie's orchestra, the guardians were their favorite instruments with which to sing the trap, and he was all too willing to be bent and shaped to their will, because he believed he couldn't outwit them, defy the grim fate that he'd know awaited him and his companions, but the gods could not be vanquished, and in the end his naivety had led the other heroes and himself to their doom. Romy had hummed that maddening song again as she flipped through the illustrated pages of his book. Tempting to follow it, isn't it? And what if that was exactly what she'd done? A metallic sound made Baz jump. There was a scuttle of feet, a sharp voice in the distance. The sense that his time was up prickled against his skin. He was no longer welcome here. Baz stuffed the note in his pocket before locking the manuscript away, discarding the white gloves and clasping the damper around his wrist once more. With his heavy book tucked under one arm, he hurried back to the center of the vault, where he caught a silhouette disappearing down the H aisle, footsteps echoing in its wake. The clerk's calling, no doubt, looking to tell him his 30 minutes were up. Feeling like he was going to be sick, Baz slid down the narrow corridor out of the vault behind the permissions desk. The clerk looked at him over her reading, oblivious to the way his heart was racing. Find everything all right? Baz gave a distracted nod as he handed her the cuff and the massive tome. She stamped the checkout card, and Baz muttered his thanks, carrying the weight of his newly acquired book and his old ones and all his unanswered questions back up to the quad. She was quite the dreamer, the clerk had said of his sister, and she had been. Not just in the way her title alignment made her a dreamer or a House Winning Moon, able to slip into people's dreams as easily as she might slip into their hearts, but a true dreamer in every sense of the word, bold, measured, and mercurial, and more bright-eyed than any star in the sky. Romy was the antithesis of Baz's own narrow existence. She never understood how content he was to sit alone with the book, nor why he desired to stay at Aldrin. After finishing undergrad, she herself had rebelled against such small aspirations, wanting to experience everything she could about Aldrin before leaving to see the world and find her place in it. She could never quite forgive him for not dreaming so big. There's only so much of life you can experience through books, Baz, she would scoff at him. But books allowed Baz to dream without fear of failing, because falling, because that was the thing about dreaming, wasn't it? Those who dreamed too big and reached too far were bound to fall in the end. And if Romy had reached for something beyond her understanding, if her wild notions had led her to Dovemir and death waiting for her in the steppes, there was one person who might have answers for him. One person who knew his sister better than he ever could. Perhaps it was more than just grief that haunted Emery. And this is of you. Please like and subscribe, and I will get you possibly one or two chapters throughout the day tomorrow. I don't know. Like again, please like and subscribe. Thank you for being patient with me, my beautiful bookworms, and have a good night.